By the mid-1960s, the Japanese film industry was in the grip of kaiju mania. Toho's Godzilla films dominated the box office, and rival studios were eager to tap into the genre's popularity. Daiei Film, a studio known for prestigious titles like Rashomon and Gate of Hell, found itself needing a hit. After the international success of King Kong vs. Godzilla in 1962, Daiei made a push to create its own monster movie. Their first attempt was 1964's giant horde beast Nezura, centered on an invasion of oversized rats. But real rats brought real problems. The production was shut down after the animals spread lice and ticks on set. The sudden cancellation left Daiei scrambling for a replacement project. Studio head Masaichi Nagata demanded a new idea, something that could compete with Godzilla. This became Attack on Tokyo by a Fire-Breathing Turtle, later expanded into a full treatment titled A Lowly Tortoise Flies Through the Sky. That was the title of the screenplay, I promise. Takahashi's story followed a nuclear explosion that awakens a massive turtle buried in Arctic ice. Within Daiei, few believed in the film. The crew worked under financial strain, relying on outdated equipment and limited resources. Gamera's suit was built by Masao Yagi and his father, both former Toho employees. The special effects were a mix of suitmation, miniature sets, and rough prop work. Gamera's iconic flight was pulled off with a mechanical model that reportedly caught fire during filming. With the title finalized as Gamera the Giant Monster, it premiered on November 27, 1965, and expectations were very low, but Gamera found an audience. The film was a surprise box office success, proving there was still room in the market for another giant monster, especially one with tusks and jet propulsion. The underdog project had landed, and Daiei now had its own kaiju to rival Godzilla. After an American jet downs an unidentified aircraft in the Arctic, a nuclear explosion awakens Gamera, a massive prehistoric turtle. Drawn to heat and radiation, Gamera leaves a trail of destruction across Japan, resisting military attacks and revealing the ability to fly. A young boy named Toshio believes that Gamera is kind and misunderstood. As devastation mounts, scientists initiate the Z-Plan to remove Gamera from Earth. Lured to Oshima Island by fire and an erupting volcano, Gamera is sealed inside a rocket and launched into space. The world celebrates while Toshio quietly says goodbye. At first glance, Gamera the Giant Monster looks like a straight-up knockoff of the original 1954 Godzilla film. It's black and white, opens with a prehistoric creature awakened by an atomic bomb, and follows the familiar arc of destruction, panic, and military scrambling, but even compared to early Toho efforts, this feels cheaper. That reputation isn't helped by how the entire Showa-era Gamera series got branded as low-rent Godzilla clones, especially once Mystery Science Theater 3000 got their hands on them. But if you can get past the obvious comparisons and budget limitations, there's actually a lot to appreciate here. First off, Gamera himself is a pretty compelling presence. While he clearly shares DNA with Godzilla, he's a weirder, more chaotic creature. One of my favorite moments in the film is when the military flips Gamera on his back and they think they've won, until he suddenly starts spinning like a top and rockets off into the sky. It's so abrupt and strange, but it works, turning what could have been a typical monster defeat into a defining moment for Gamera's character. He's unpredictable in a way that feels oddly fresh. Even more interesting is how the movie immediately plants the idea that Gamera might not be a typical mindless destroyer. In the early scenes, he saves a young boy named Toshio from falling to his death, which introduces the idea that he's not necessarily evil, just dangerous and misunderstood. This idea becomes a defining trait in later films, where he becomes the guardian of all children, or friend of all children, depending on your understanding. It's clunky here, but you can see the seeds being planted. That said, the film has one huge problem. The human characters are dull across the board. The scientists and military officials do what they're supposed to do. Look concerned, bark orders, explain the stakes, but they're forgettable. And then there's Toshio. Who is the film's attempt at an emotional core, but it doesn't work whatsoever. He's supposed to be the one character who sees Gamera's potential for good, but the movie gives him almost nothing to support that claim. Gamera saves him one time, and that's enough for Toshio to spend the rest of the movie insisting Gamera is actually a kind soul who doesn't want to hurt anyone. Meanwhile, we then watch Gamera destroy entire city blocks and almost kill dozens of people, God knows how many. There's a scene where Toshio sneaks off during an attack to get closer to Gamera, nearly getting an innocent worker killed in the process. Later, when the survivors mock him, the movie tries to make us feel bad for Toshio, but honestly, I was on their side the whole time.
Gamera's my friend, he's good!
Yeah, I know. Here, put this on. Go on.
Like, this kid's an asshole.
Go on. Whoa, kid. I'll say goodbye to Gamera for you.
I mean, the idea of a kid empathizing with a monster could totally work. Gamera the Brave nails this dynamic with more care and patience, but here, Toshio just comes off as an obnoxious, oblivious kid who can't read the room. Or the growing body count. If Gamera had a few more clear-cut moments of compassion, Toshio's faith might seem a bit more reasonable. Instead, it just feels like the movie is bending over backwards to justify his poor behavior with barely anything to stand on. Oddly enough, though, some of the most effective human moments come from completely unrelated characters. There's a great little scene at a go-go bar where a bunch of new characters who are never seen before and never seen again after are partying as Gamera approaches. The police show up and tell them to evacuate, but they just kind of shrug it off and keep dancing. These kinds of throwaway vignettes actually add a lot, and I love when giant monster movies include these. They give the city a sense of life beyond the core cast, and help sell the idea that this is a world full of people trying to go about their lives as a giant turtle rains hell from above. It's a small thing, but it makes the destruction feel just so much more grounded. And speaking of destruction, the action sequences are genuinely fun to watch, especially with the black and white cinematography giving everything a slightly grittier and more grounded texture. I've always thought that kaiju suits and miniatures just look better without color. There's something about the lack of polish that makes it easier to buy into the illusion, but while the tone and contrast help, the actual image quality doesn't. The cinematography here is muddy, with poor exposure that swallows detail in the shadows. Even modern restorations like Arrow Video Blu-ray can't fully rescue it. The effects work is solid for the budget, but it's often hard to see what's happening. And the budget is rough. Even the cheapest Toho Godzilla films never quite looked this strapped for cash. Sets are sparse, miniatures are wobbly, and the monster's suit looks bulky and awkward. But there's something charming about how hard the filmmakers are trying here. It's a scrappy patchwork production that's constantly punching above its weight, and every once in a while it lands a hit. What really caught me off guard with Gamera the Giant Monster is how direct it is with its political themes. Most films from this era try to say something, but it tends to lean on metaphors or vague gestures, and a lot of it just comes off as being preachy or self-important. But this film doesn't do that. It's blunt in a way that feels pointed and angry, almost spiteful. Gamera doesn't rise up from the ocean because of an abstract moral failing or some accidental scientific experiment. He's awakened because an American military plane carrying a nuclear bomb crashes in the Arctic. There's never any ambiguity there. The blame is placed squarely on foreign intervention. The film immediately lays out a cause and effect chain. The US detonates a bomb in contested airspace, Gamera emerges, and Japan pays the price. It's hard not to think about Hiroshima and Nagasaki in that instance. The history lingers in the background, even if the film never mentions it directly. Gamera's rampage through Japanese cities brings with it that familiar imagery of fire and destruction, of civilians running through the streets, of entire neighborhoods reduced to rubble. And it's never really framed as an accident or as a tragedy of nature. The film is saying that Japan is once again suffering because of decisions made by powerful nations that see it as a playing field rather than a country. This is one of the more compelling elements of the film, and it's what makes the English dub just so frustrating to watch. Quick side note, by the way, people have commented about this. On all my retrospectives, I watched the Japanese version first, then the American dub, just as a clarification. The dub doesn't really do its job of just translating the dialogue. It tries to localize the movie and rewrite the movie's meaning. One of the added lines has a character thanking the United Nations and other countries besides Japan for helping to defeat Gamera, which is kind of true in the Japanese version, but it's a bit bizarre how emphasized it is, and it feels completely at odds with everything that the film was setting up.
The Mars rocket of the Z-Plan, constructed with the combined efforts of the world's superpowers, was successfully launched just now with Gamera imprisoned inside.
The original version spends its entire runtime showing how Japan is left alone to deal with the disaster created by someone else, and the dub reframes that more as a group project where the international community steps in as the savior, and to me that comes off as being just a little dishonest. It feels like the American distributors saw the original cut and basically thought, okay, we can't have Americans be the bad guy, let's let's get rid of that part. And the result is this very weird disconnect where the tone of the film is angry and accusatory, but the dubbed version tries to smooth things over and injects some optimism that was never really there to begin with. This is what gives the original Japanese version its edge. It doesn't offer a clean resolution or a hopeful message. Gamera doesn't die or repent or transform into a misunderstood hero, at least in this film. He gets tricked into a rocket and shot into space. That's it. There's no justice, there's no redemption, just a containment strategy to lock the problem up and launch it out of sight. It feels more like a gesture of desperation than a real victory. The film ends without resolution, and that lack of closure really says something, for better or for worse. Gamera is gone, but the damage remains. Japan is still dealing with the aftermath of something it didn't cause. And while the film does try to have kind of a happy ending in the American version, you still get the sense that, yeah, like, tons of lives were lost. The countries responsible get to just move on. And the ending, in my opinion, is kind of disappointing for entirely different reasons as an audience member. You wonder how the military is going to defeat Gamera throughout the whole film, and they just put him in an egg-shaped rocket and send him to space. It's unique, but it just falls flat for me, and it doesn't work with the rest of the film. Something I want to talk about is the English dub, specifically just how available they are to everyone. I mean, you can go right now on YouTube and watch this movie and pretty much every Gamera movie in the entire franchise for free on YouTube. Like, it was just uploaded by some random guy. And to this day, most of the English dubs are the most accessible versions floating around on YouTube, and even some weird, like, public domain collections, which I don't even want to get into that. That's all legal stuff that, frankly, I don't care about. But it's often in less than ideal quality. And sure, on one hand, it's great because it allows for people to just watch these movies completely for free. It's super accessible. That's something that I've always celebrated. That's why my movies are made for free on YouTube for anyone to watch. But with Gamera, it means that you are watching the worst possible version of the movie. One of the dubs that I watched for this very retrospective is a perfect example. It feels like it was thrown together without much care or coordination. The voice actors speak with this awkward, rushed cadence, as if they're reading straight off the page for the very first time without ever hearing the original performances.
Hello, how do you do, sir? We are from the exploration ship Chidori Maru.
I know.
It's full of these weird pauses, unnatural stutters, and flat line deliveries that don't match what's happening on screen.
Captain, the ice is getting thicker. Shall we keep going?
Of course, we must get through.
The dialogue really doesn't feel lived in or considered, it's just filler. Worse than that, some of the voices sound like caricatures. Instead of trying to match the tone of the Japanese version, they go for these over-the-top cartoonish inflections that make it impossible to take any scene seriously.
Thank you.
Bye.
It reminded me of the old Speed Racer cartoon, where every line has this breathless urgency.
And from now on, there'll be enough money for the doctors to make you well again.
Whether someone was talking about a monster or just having a conversation on an airplane about an uninteresting topic.
Yes. It was a lottery with human lives.
You can tell the dub was made quickly and cheaply, but it's more than just a production issue. It ultimately changes how the movie feels. You lose the weight of what's happening. Gamera becomes more of a sideshow, and the film's quieter, more serious moments come off as awkward or unintentionally funny. It becomes harder to connect with the characters when their voices are constantly breaking immersion. Even someone like Toshio, who already feels misguided in the original, ends up sounding completely ridiculous in the dub. You stop seeing him as a misguided child and start seeing him as a joke.
Come here.
Leave me alone! No! I don't want to go! Let go! Let go!
Come back here.
I don't want to get off!
Thankfully, this isn't the only version of the film. Alongside the standard English dub, you can also find a completely re-edited American version called Gamera the Invincible, with 2 M's in Gamera. Like what happened to Godzilla, when it was re-released in the US in 1956 with Raymond Burr in Godzilla, King of the Monsters. It takes what was originally a Japanese story about foreign-caused destruction and reframes it through the lens of Cold War propaganda. It's hard not to feel like the film is being pulled in two directions here. One is the original version, more raw and national in its anger, and the other is a sanitized retelling, where America is suddenly responsible for saving the day, with the United Nations and the international community playing only a very minuscule role. Watching both versions back to back like I did is like listening to someone tell a story, only to have someone else immediately jump in to correct them and say, well actually this happened. It's easy to brush off these dubs and re-edits as historical curiosities or relics of their time, but they do matter. They shape how entire generations viewed these films in certain parts of the world. For a very, very long time, people didn't really see Gamera the Giant Monster. They saw whatever American distributors wanted it to be. And while part of the charm of these old monster movies is tied up in their low-budget translations and goofy voice work, I think it's important to acknowledge how much they warped the original intent. It's one thing to have a silly dub, it's another to have an entirely different movie posing as the original. That's why I'm telling you right now, please, for the love of God, go watch the Japanese version. Ignore the American versions that are out on YouTube right now. I know it's appealing to just watch a movie for free, but like you could find the original Japanese version if you look hard enough. Personally, I recommend just getting that Arrow video box set. It's incredible. Highly recommend it. 5 stars. Go check it out. Gamera vs. Barugon was the second film in the Gamera series, and it's where the franchise really started becoming what it's known for, Gamera fighting another monster. The first movie had done well, surprisingly well, so Daiei wasted no time in rushing out a sequel the very next year. This time they upped the budget, aiming for a more serious tone and wanting to compete directly with Toho's Godzilla. Behind the scenes, the push from Daiei came from President Masaichi Nagata. He'd been skeptical of the original Gamera film at first, but changed his tune after it turned a profit. For the sequel, Nagata didn't want another scrappy low-budget gamble. He wanted something prestigious, so he gave the green light for a significantly larger budget and treated the production as an A-list title. Unlike the original, which was shot in black and white and made with limited resources, Gamera vs. Barugon was filmed in full color using Daiei's in-house widescreen format. But figuring out what kind of story to tell took some trial and error. Early drafts were wildly different from the final product. One of the earliest pitches was called Gamera vs. the Icemen from Outer Space. That version was packed with flying saucers, volcanic eruptions, and an apocalyptic blizzard caused by alien invaders. Another treatment toyed with a Scandinavian ice giant, presumably to cash in on the mythological monster trend. Neither script made it past the developmental stage, but the cold-themed villain stuck, and that eventually became Barugon, a lizard-like creature who breathes a freezing mist, shooting a rainbow death ray from his back, and doesn't really resemble anything from Norse mythology anymore. Nissan Takahashi returned to write the screenplay after having worked on the original film. This would mark the beginning of his long tenure with the Gamera series, eventually writing every entry in the Showa era. For Barugon, he ditched the space aliens and leaned into something more grounded, a wartime story about buried treasure, betrayal, and hubris. The final script centers on a World War II veteran who returns to New Guinea to retrieve a mysterious opal that he buried during the war, only to find out that it's actually a giant monster egg. It's a much more adult film than the first, and really it's kind of the outlier from the rest of the series. Sure, Gamera vs. Gyaos does have a bloodthirsty man-eating monster, but this film has no kids whatsoever in it. It really feels like an outlier, beyond Gamera being kind of evil in the first film, but beyond that, it's weird. Noriaki Uwasa, the director of the original Gamera film, was still involved, but he didn't direct. He was in a different role. Apparently, studio executives just didn't trust him to helm a prestigious project after the rough edges of the first film, so they brought in veteran director Shigeo Tanaka to take over. Tanaka was known for dramatic films, not kaiju, and reportedly approached the project with a more serious tone in mind from the start. Rather than being bitter about the change, Uwasa accepted a demotion to special effects director, but he still had significant creative input, particularly on the monster scenes, which he co-directed. According to Uwasa, the collaboration was smooth. He described their working relationship as being like a father and son, with Tanaka guiding the dramatic elements while Yuasa focused on the monster spectacle. The effects work itself was more ambitious than before. Barugon required a complex suit complete with a long tongue mechanism. The freezing mist was created using liquid nitrogen, something that looked great on camera but was hazardous to the suit actors who had to time their performances precisely to avoid injury. These practical challenges were very common in tokusatsu at the time, but Daiei's crew was trying to push the envelope, and the effort shows. As for the movie itself, Gamera vs. Barugon is one that I always overlooked as a kid. Part of that was the immature kid-brained assumption that Barugon was just a knockoff of Barugon from the Godzilla films. Trust me, we'll get there when we get there. But mostly, I just remember thinking that this movie was slow and kind of boring. It wasn't the kind of Saturday morning popcorn kaiju flick that lit my brain on fire. There wasn't any citywide destruction or wild energy right off the bat. There wasn't a goofy kid protagonist getting a front row seat to the monster fights. And for some reason, that mattered to me as a kid. I don't know why. But rewatching it now, I was surprised by how much I enjoyed it. There's something restrained and methodical about Barugon that I didn't appreciate until I got older. It's not a crowd pleaser in the usual sense, but it has its own kind of rhythm. If you're wondering why I changed my mind, or what this movie does right despite its reputation, then stay tuned. This is Gamera vs. Barugon. 6 months after being trapped in space, Gamera is freed by a meteor and returns to Earth, absorbing energy from Kurobe Dam before flying off. Meanwhile, ex-soldier Ichiro sends his brother Keisuke to New Guinea to retrieve a giant opal he hid during World War II. Keisuke finds it, but his comrade Onodera betrays the group, killing one man and trying to take the treasure for himself. Back in Japan, the opal turns out to be an egg, and it hatches into Barugon, a giant monster with deadly ice breath and a rainbow death ray. Gamera tries to stop him but is frozen in battle. With the help of Karen, a New Guinea native, Keisuke works with the Japanese self-defense force to lure Barugon into a lake, using a diamond as bait. Onodera returns to steal it but is killed by Barugon. Gamera revives, defeats Barugon in a fierce fight, and peace is restored once more. Right off the bat, Gamera vs. Barugon is a massive step up from its predecessor, Gamera the Giant Monster. The most immediate difference is the switch from black and white to color. While I don't usually consider black and white to be a drawback, in fact, I love black and white movies, Gamera is a character that really benefits from a saturated and stylized environment. He's not a creature that thrives in muted tones or expressionist shadows. He feels at home in something closer to a graphic novel, something big, something bold, and something physical, and the color format really brings that out in a way that the original film just never could. The miniature work in this film is also genuinely impressive. A lot of that comes down to the wide depth of field that was used in the cinematography. Shots hold focus across multiple planes, which lets you really take in the scale of the destruction. It's unmistakably cheaper than what Toho was doing with the Godzilla series around the same time, as there's a noticeable flatness to some of the sets, and not all the destruction holds up under scrutiny, but the way it's shot sells the illusion better than it has any right to. You feel the size of the monsters, not just because they're towering over buildings, but because the camera gives their movements enough space to breathe. What also stands out is how the film commits to real horror in the human storyline. Early in the film, Kawajiri, Onodera, and Keisuke make their way through the jungle, and the atmosphere feels genuinely dangerous. There's a quicksand scene that's particularly brutal, with it being shot in a wide, unbroken take. It lets the moment stretch out uncomfortably as Kawajiri is slowly pulled under. It's not played for thrills or spectacle, and it definitely isn't comic relief. You're just stuck there watching as the other two try to pull him out. The sequence that follows, where Kawajiri is then stung by a scorpion and dies, doubles down on that horror. Yuzo Hayakawa gives a performance that goes way harder than you'd expect for this kind of material. He's clawing at the ground, convulsing, sweating. It's unnerving. None of it is exaggerated or cartoonish. It's a serious moment, and it works. What really makes the scene land, though, is how it builds Onodera as a genuinely despicable character. He watches the scorpion crawl up Kawajiri's leg and chooses to do nothing about it. There's no ambiguity. There's no moment of hesitation. It's a calculated decision to let someone die. That choice tells you everything you need to know about him. He's not the kind of villain that you roll your eyes at as he monologues endlessly. He's cold, cruel, and completely self-serving. A lot of that is in the writing, sure, but Koji Fujiyama brings this physical intimidation to the role that makes Onodera feel dangerous in a way that most human villains in kaiju films don't. He's not just evil in the abstract, he's more than capable of violence, and that violence feels personal. Even in the quieter scenes, the film doesn't let up. Akira Natsuki's performance as Ichiro is another high point. There's a moment where Onodera tells him that Keisuke is dead. Natsuki doesn't go big with it, there's no screaming, no melodramatic breakdown, but you can see the hurt. He's absorbing the information while also registering that something is off. And Onodera's performance in the same scene is just as layered. He's lying, but he's doing it in a way that sounds halfway sincere, which makes it even more unsettling. He's controlling the narrative while keeping his own role in the supposed death completely hidden. These kinds of scenes give the film a human core that actually works. The stakes feel earned, the emotions are grounded, and the performances elevate material that could have easily fallen flat. There are so many moments where I watch these scenes and I go, in another movie, this could have definitely been played for laughs. I think about the quicksand scene or the scorpion scene. All those could have just been joke scenes in, say, a Godzilla film that's set on an island and it becomes very goofy very fast. But here, in a genre where the human characters are often disposable or one note, Gamera vs. Barugon takes the time to make them count. One of the most frustrating aspects of the film, though, is the use of brownface. Japanese actors are made up to resemble tribespeople from New Guinea, darkening their skin and dressing in exaggerated, primitive costumes. This choice is jarring, and it immediately distances you from the world the film is trying to create. I already touched on this topic in my King Kong vs. Godzilla retrospective, where I had similar criticisms. While I understand that budget constraints and limited casting options played a role, the final result just doesn't sit well with me. Now, some people pushed back when I brought this up before in that King Kong vs. Godzilla retrospective, suggesting I was being too sensitive or arguing that Asian actors in brownface are somehow exempt from that criticism. I don't buy that. Regardless of the actor's background, the decision to depict a fictionalized indigenous tribe using dark makeup and stereotypes just hasn't aged well. These characters are hardly characters. They aren't given depth or cultural identity. They're just presented as set dressing, and they're there to signal a vague sense of the exotic. It's not full-blown minstrel performance or anything, but it still relies on caricature. There's a big difference between playing a character from another culture and flattening that culture into something cartoonish. The film's structure also raises a lot of problems. It begins with a very exciting sequence where Gamera returns to Earth and attacks a hydroelectric plant, giving us immediate action and spectacle, but he vanishes almost as quickly as he arrives. The story pivots into a grounded, human-focused plot involving three men trying to retrieve a mysterious opal. The tone shifts completely, and for a while, the movie feels like it belongs to another genre entirely. Hell, another film entirely. The kaiju aren't even mentioned for a long stretch of time, and the momentum from the opening disappears. That's not to say I'm brain-rotted and that it's like, oh, you need to talk about giant monsters all the time in your giant monster movie, but I love the human storyline. I think it's one of the more compelling plots in a Showa-era Gamera film. The tension between the men, especially as greed and betrayal take center stage, gives the story some weight, and the reveal that the opal is actually a monster egg is a strong twist. The problem isn't the material itself, but it's the way that it's isolated from the kaiju narrative. Gamera and Barugon don't really enter the picture until nearly the halfway mark if you forget about the opening scene, which creates a sense of detachment. It's a film that's only 88 minutes long, and that delay is very hard for me to overlook when half the movie, if not more, is dedicated to strictly human stuff with no monsters whatsoever. Once Barugon does appear, though, the film regains its footing. His design stands out among other monsters of the era. The detailing on the suit gives him weight and presence, and the filmmakers make smart use of scale to make him feel massive. His abilities are also very inventive compared to other monsters of the time. The freezing breath is a striking visual, and the rainbow beam that fires from his back is so strange and colorful that it becomes oddly beautiful. It's refreshing to see a monster with powers that don't fall back on fire or electricity. For a 1960s kaiju film, there's real imagination in how Barugon is presented. Naturally, comparisons to Barugon from Toho's Frankenstein vs. Barugon come up. The names are nearly identical. Both monsters are quadrupeds, and there's even a resemblance to Anguirus in Barugon's posture and movements. This has led some to accuse Daiei of copying Toho, but I don't think that argument necessarily holds up in this very instance. Sure, Gamera was designed to ape off of the success of Godzilla. The thing is, the production timelines overlapped here, and there's no clear evidence that Gamera vs. Barugon or Frankenstein vs. Barugon influenced one or the other. Similar ideas appearing in close proximity happens all the time in film. Take The Cat Concerto and Rhapsody Rabbit, two nearly identical animated shorts that were produced in the same year by different studios, each accusing the other of plagiarism or theft. Coincidence doesn't always imply imitation. That said, I get why people associate the Gamera franchise with being a Godzilla knockoff. Naming your monster Barugon and releasing it a year after Barugon just doesn't help the optics, and even if it wasn't intentional, the comparisons are inevitable. The Gamera series has always struggled to break out of that shadow, and choices like this have only reinforced the perception over time. I don't think it's fair to dismiss the entire franchise entirely on those grounds, but I understand why it's earned that reputation. The English dub of Gamera vs. Barugon presents a mix of improvements and missteps. One of the most noticeable issues is the pronunciation of Gamera as Gamera.
Gamera was lured into a rocket, which was sealed and shot to Mars.
Gamera! Gamera!
Gamera senses that a volcano is erupting on the other side of the world.
This alteration probably stems from a deliberate choice to avoid confusion with the word camera, the English word, similar to how Puckman was changed to Pac-Man in the US to prevent vandalism, altering the P to an F. Fuckman. Additionally, the spelling was actually modified to Gamera with two M's, further distinguishing it from camera. Despite these changes, the dub performances in this installment feel way more natural compared to those in Gamera the Giant Monster. While not exceptional, there's a noticeable uptick in quality, making the dialogue a lot more palatable and less stilted.
How can you be sure? 1945 is a long time ago.
The cave is supposed to be haunted by some beast called the Ava.
In the United States, the film was released under the title War of the Monsters. This generic title does very little to convey the unique aspects of the film, and contributes to the perception of the Gamera series as being derivative of other kaiju franchises. In my opinion, I hate it because the title lacks specificity and fails to capture the distinctiveness of the Gamera-Barugon conflict to the point where I forget which movie War of the Monsters even is in the first place. The US release history of Gamera vs. Barugon is convoluted. Initially, American International Television acquired the film and dubbed it into English in Rome, Italy. This version was offered to US television stations in 1967 as part of a syndication package with other sci-fi B-movies. Later in 1987, King Features Entertainment released the film to television and VHS under the original title of Gamera vs. Barugon. The film's multiple English dubs and title changes have unfortunately led to inconsistencies in pronunciation and branding, further complicating its identity in the international market. These alterations, while perhaps well-intentioned, have contributed to the perception of the Gamera series as lacking the cohesiveness and prestige of its temporary kaiju counterparts. By 1967, Daiei Studios understood that they had to change direction. The first Gamera film had been grim and destructive. The second leaned into that seriousness even further, but Gamera vs. Barugon failed to connect. Audiences weren't showing up the way that the studio had hoped. The issue wasn't with the monsters or the effects, but instead the tone. Kids just weren't responding the way that Daiei had hoped. The studio realized that Gamera didn't need to feel like a shadow of Godzilla, but he needed his own identity. Noriaki Yuasa, the director of the very first Gamera film, returned to direct this third installment after being left out of the production of Gamera vs. Barugon in the director's seat. Instead, he directed the special effects work. He had always seen Gamera as a potential hero. The original film had ended with a note of tragedy, but Yuasa believed the character could grow into something more. He pushed for a version of Gamera that felt warm and protective. The studio agreed and gave him full control. Yuasa also took over the special effects work, which let him shape the film's tone from both sides of the production. You see, usually with movies like these, you would have a director that would mainly focus on the human drama, and then the special effects director would control all the kaiju action. Writer Nissan Takahashi returned as well. His script focused on a more simpler and more direct story. A boy named Iichi becomes the emotional core of the film. He's the one who understands Gamera, believes in him, and helps guide the story forward. That choice gives the film structure. Gamera is good, Gyaos is bad. The audience is never confused, and it really helps lock the film into being a kids' movie, but without really talking down to them. Despite having a successful box office run, Gamera's place in the kaiju world was becoming clearer, but there were still problems behind the scenes with Daiei. Television was taking viewers away from theaters, and the studio's financial future was very unstable. Gyaos didn't fix that, but it gave Daiei a win that they needed badly, and it proved that Gamera had staying power when used the right way. More than anything, this was the moment that Gamera changed. He's no longer a loose cannon, no longer a danger. This film made him into something new. From here on, Gamera as a character had a purpose, and it started with Gamera vs. Gyaos. A volcanic eruption draws Gamera to Mount Fuji, where he absorbs lava for energy. Nearby, a strange glow signals the awakening of Gyaos, a massive bat-like creature with a supersonic beam. After eating a man and nearly abducting a child, Gyaos battles Gamera, severely wounding him. As Gyaos begins attacking cities and feeding on blood, scientists learn it is nocturnal and fatally sensitive to sunlight. A failed trap involving artificial blood leads the JSDF and villagers to set a massive forest fire, hoping to lure Gyaos into a final fight. Gamera returns, withstands Gyaos' beam, and forces a close-quarters battle at dawn. In the final moments, Gamera drags Gyaos into Mount Fuji's crater, Gyaos burns alive in the lava, and Gamera flies away, battered but victorious. Gamera vs. Gyaos is where the series finally commits to an identity. The idea of Gamera as a friend to children had been introduced before, but only in a vague way. The first film mentioned it without doing much with it, and Gamera vs. Barugon ignored it completely. This time the concept is at the center of the story. Gamera actively protects a child and is framed as a hero rather than a destructive force. That shift gives the character direction and makes him feel distinct from Godzilla, who at the time was still being kinda goofy with Minya and being a hero, but he could still destroy every now and then and was a reluctant savior. Gamera, though, it's clear that he was here to save people, especially kids, and that clarity benefits the tone and the structure of the film. Even though this entry is more accessible for children, it doesn't feel empty or overly sanitized. There are real moments of danger, and the film establishes consequences early on. One of the first major action scenes shows a laser shooting from a cavern and slicing a helicopter in half. The passengers inside are killed instantly. It's a quick, brutal moment that signals the stakes of the story. The effects might not really be all too convincing, especially by today's standards, but the decision to include that scene, I think, shows a commitment to keeping the danger grounded. It's a balance that the film tries to maintain of having a lighter tone while there being an actual threat. It's difficult to pull off, and Gamera vs. Gyaos handles it better than many of the later Godzilla films that would aim for a similar child audience. That being said, though, the tone is a noticeable departure from Gamera vs. Barugon, which leaned way more into a somber and more mature atmosphere. Again, it struggled financially, so this new direction feels very reactive to that. Rather than returning to bleak storytelling, Gyaos retools the entire formula. There's still death and conflict and danger, but it does so in a way that's easier for kids to follow without turning the story into an outright cartoon. Gyaos is menacing and destructive, and his presence carries weight, and that really helps the pacing. There's always something at risk, and the film never loses sight of that. While I do miss the mood and weight of Barugon, this feels like a logical next step. The series is learning how to communicate with its intended audience. Gamera feels like a complete character now. He's not just reacting to events, he's making choices, and those choices come from a place of compassion. That alone is enough to carry the film. It makes the action matter and gives the story a sense of emotional payoff. However, you expect him to take a more central role this time around, but after that introduction, Gamera steps out of the spotlight. He leaves after being seriously injured in his first fight with Gyaos, and for a large stretch of the film, he is nowhere to be found. The film just feels like it's waiting for something to kick back in, as most of the time you're like, oh, I wonder how the military is going to stop Gyaos, and then you're like, wasn't this movie called Gamera vs. Gyaos? But the improvement in pacing is very noticeable, especially compared to Gamera vs. Barugon. That film spent way too much time building toward its kaiju action, and the delay made it feel sluggish. Here, the stakes are established very early on, and the threat is consistent. Gyaos is active throughout the middle of the movie, and the military scenes at least maintain some forward momentum, but even with the better structure, Gamera's absence does become a problem. The audience is drawn to him because of who he's supposed to be in this world. When he disappears for large stretches of the movie, the film loses a bit of its anchor. Gyaos can carry scenes, but the narrative just doesn't feel as balanced without the presence of the hero. That being said, though, Gamera's return in the final act gives the film the jolt that it so desperately needs. The last battle is full of movement, and there's a sense of payoff in seeing Gamera step up again. What really stands out in these scenes is the visual language of the fight. Whenever Gamera takes a hit, he bleeds bright green. It's a simple effect, but it works so well. It makes the damage feel real, and it gives the battle a more physical texture. It's hard not to feel like the film underuses its lead. The moments where Gamera is on screen are fantastic, and they show how well the character works when he's part of the momentum, but the structure leans heavily on Gyaos, and it sidelines Gamera during some of the most important narrative developments. Gyaos' first appearance is one of the strongest moments in the film. The atmosphere shifts immediately. The scene is quiet, drawn out, and patient, letting the dread build before we see him. When he finally emerges, the framing and lighting push things closer to horror than spectacle. The way the camera lingers on his silhouette gives the moment a weight that stays with you. His first kill, where he devours Okabe, is brutal and sudden. Okabe had earlier abandoned a child to save himself, and his death lands with a kind of narrative justice. It never feels like a throwaway moment. Instead, it's a statement about who Gyaos is and how this film plans to treat its characters. I mean, he literally gets eaten in a kid's movie. Gyaos' entire design is built around aggression. His body is all harsh angles and sharp points, with nothing soft or familiar to break the tension. He looks engineered to do damage. That silhouette helps communicate what kind of creature he is before you even really see him in action. The contrast between his jagged form and Gamera's more rounded shape really makes a nice visual dichotomy. Where Gamera feels sturdy and grounded, Gyaos looks unstable and fast. The design works because it reflects the behavior of each monster. Every action builds on that first impression, and the visual choices stay consistent throughout the film. Beyond the design of the creature, what makes Gyaos so effective is his intention. He doesn't stumble through cities or lash out by accident. He's not a tragic figure. He targets people and follows through. There's a difference between a monster that causes destruction and a monster that causes harm. Gyaos looks for victims. He watches, selects, and then kills. That level of focus raises the tension of every scene that he's in, because the danger becomes way more direct, and the film is really strong for it. As a result, the human characters have to respond with urgency. Gyaos doesn't leave time for disbelief or debate. His attacks demand action, and the plot keeps moving forward because of that pressure. The effects work in Gamera vs. Gyaos shows a very clear step forward in execution. Several miniature sets are lit and staged with care, and the destruction sequences feel thoughtfully constructed. One standout moment comes when two workers look out a window and see Gyaos standing far in the distance. It's a very simple composition, but it captures the scale of the threat in a way that feels so grounded. That kind of shot reinforces the illusion that these monsters exist in the same world as the people reacting to them. It blends that whole, let's film the human scenes separate from the monster scenes, and makes everything feel really seamless. The camera doesn't need to move, but it just holds the frame long enough to let the tension settle. Scenes like that make it easier to accept the less convincing moments. Some of the flying shots with Gyaos are a bit awkward and poorly integrated. The puppet used for those sequences lacks articulation, and it often drifts through the air without any sense of actual weight or movement. The difference between the suit and the puppet is extremely noticeable, and it breaks the rhythm when it happens during high-stakes moments. The aerial work doesn't ruin the film, though, but I do think it draws attention away from the story whenever the model appears on screen for way too long. Even with those shortcomings, Gyaos' main rampage through the city is handled well. The scene where he flies low over a cluster of buildings and causes them to collapse has real energy to it. There's a strong visual rhythm to how the buildings fall one after the other, and the destruction feels focused rather than chaotic. The sequence is clearly influenced by Rodan, but the execution holds up. What sets this apart is Gyaos' behavior. The way he attacks civilians is just terrifying. The scenes of him eating people add so much purpose to the destruction. I've said this before, I love it when giant monster movies have a kaiju actually target people specifically, instead of just walking around the city and destroying buildings, because it makes it so much more horrifying for the human characters knowing, yeah, this giant monster wants to kill me specifically. And it works so well here with Gamera versus Gyaos. I do think that the choice to stage this attack at night really makes the entire sequence all the more effective. The lighting design is so bold, with colorful signage and neon spilling across the frame. Many nighttime monster scenes from this era suffer from poor visibility, but that's just not the case here. I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that I'm watching this on the Arrow Video Blu-ray, and so it looks wonderful. Highly recommend you pick it up. And in this specific version of the film, the contrast is very clean, and the compositing is really good. It's better than I would expect, actually. Gyaos remains clearly visible in the dark, and the miniature sets look even more detailed under that lighting. It's one of the best looking sequences in the entire film, and it shows that the team knew how to use atmosphere to strengthen the action. However, the human characters in Gamera vs. Gyaos don't leave much of an impression. Their presence serves the plot without ever really shaping it. Iichi, the child at the center of the story, is passable as a protagonist. He doesn't annoy or distract, and he fits the tone of the film well enough. His main role is to support Gamera and to react with awe when the monsters appear. That kind of character works in a film that is aimed at younger viewers, but there's not much to engage with beyond surface level charm. He exists to give the audience someone to identify with, and the film doesn't expect much more from him. The rest of the cast falls even further into the background. Scientists explain Gyaos' biology, military officials attempt to coordinate counterattacks, a few townspeople offer some commentary, but these characters never really step outside of their functions. They are never really written with enough detail to be memorable. They move the story forward, but they don't offer much in terms of tone, theme, or conflict. This lack of investment is especially noticeable after Gamera vs. Barugon. That film treated its human plotline with serious attention and gave its characters a clear emotional arc. There was betrayal, survival, and an ongoing sense of consequence tied directly to human decisions, but here, the plot never slows down long enough to develop anything close to that. The pacing may benefit from that simplicity, but the emotional core suffers as a result. Again, I'm not asking for Godzilla -1 level like human storytelling, but I just wish that there was someone that we could follow through the chaos. Instead, the film relies entirely on Gyaos and Gamera to carry the entire weight of the narrative. It's not that the human characters are poorly written, it's that they're just thin and are cardboard cutouts to progress the story. The film never gives them room to grow, and the performances reflect that limitation. No one undermines the story, but no one strengthens it either. When Gamera vs. Gyaos was prepared for international release outside of Japan, the distributors took several different approaches to localization. The most immediate change was the title. For American television, the film was renamed to Return of the Giant Monsters. It stripped away any reference to Gamera in the title, likely to make it feel more accessible to audiences who were unfamiliar with the character at the time. Two main English dubs were created. The first was produced by American International Television for US broadcast, and it featured a new voice cast with English language signage replacing Japanese text, and a removed vocal theme song. This version also mispronounced Gamera consistently, which stuck out to even the most casual viewers. Despite the issues, this dub became the one most widely seen in the US throughout the 1970s. Daiei also had a separate dub made through Axis International in Hong Kong. This version was later picked up by Sandy Frank and released on VHS during the 1980s under the title Gamera vs. Gyaos, spelled G-A-O-S. The script was closer to the Japanese version, and it's honestly my favorite dub that exists for this film. Both dubs can be found on the Arrow Video Blu-ray box set, and if you're keen on watching this movie dubbed, then check out the Daiei one, and stay far away from the garbage AIT version. But of course, you could always just watch it subbed, which, I do anyways. To wrap everything up, Gamera vs. Gyaos marks a very odd but meaningful turning point where the series starts to settle into its identity. The story moves with intention, and the monster action is framed with a stronger sense of rhythm and visual clarity. It feels like the filmmakers finally knew what kind of film they were making. Even when the effects fall short or the human characters lack depth, the momentum never breaks. Gamera vs. Gyaos earns its place through steady pacing, distinct visuals, and a monster that finally carries real presence. In early 1968, Daiei Film was weighing on financial collapse. Their budget for Gamera vs. Viras was slashed to roughly $140,000. Of course, it was in yen, not USD, but I'm trying to make it easier for you guys to understand. Now, that was barely a third of what its predecessors had received. Noriaki Yuasa returned as director and special effects supervisor, believing this low-cost entry might very well be the last. He went into production determined to keep it simple and sincere. Filming began at Daiei Tokyo Studios. Yuasa pushed for a strong connection between the monster and the children, drawing inspiration from Mission Impossible for espionage-like sequences. Daiei had only 25 days to shoot the movie. They reused a ton of stock footage from earlier Gamera films in order to cut costs. An agreement with American International Television required an American child actor to be in the movie. No bilingual performers were available, so they cast Carl Craig, son of a US serviceman stationed in Japan, in what would be his only acting role in a movie. When production ended, Yuasa considered this film to be his favorite out of any other movie in the Gamera franchise. Which is insane to me, and we'll talk about why, but was he on drugs? That being said, a lot of that has to do with the fact that he made his own cut of the film. On the Arrow Blu-ray, there's actually 3 versions of Gamera vs. Viras: the theatrical cut, the director's cut, and the extended American cut. The biggest difference between the theatrical cut and the director's cut is that the theatrical cut relies way less on stock footage and flashbacks to prior films in the franchise. Meanwhile, the American extended cut is a bloated mess that is even more reliant on stock footage. As a result, I do think the best version to watch is the theatrical cut. At a brisk 72 minutes in length, I seriously can't recommend that specific version enough. If there's one thing I've been consistent about in all of my critiques, it's pacing, but we'll get into the specifics of my analysis on this movie eventually. However, I just want to make it clear that the theatrical cut is the version of the film that I will be primarily reviewing and discussing in this very video, because the other versions just don't have a ton of original material, if any. It's all reused stuff. With Daiei's future uncertain, Gamera vs. Viras managed to hold things together thanks to Yuasa's direction, a catchy new theme song, and the continued focus on Gamera's connection to children. Without wasting any more time, this is 1968's Gamera vs. Viras. When an alien spaceship attempts to invade Earth, the crew is thwarted by Gamera. In response, the aliens capture 2 Boy Scouts and use them to control Gamera through mind manipulation. Under their influence, Gamera attacks parts of Japan. The boys eventually escape and break the aliens' control over him. The invaders then combine into a giant squid-like monster named Viras. Gamera battles Viras in a lengthy fight, ultimately defeating the creature by carrying it high into the atmosphere and dropping it to its death. With the alien threat eliminated, Gamera returns to the ocean and the boys are safely reunited with their families. Gamera vs. Viras is officially the point where the series stops aiming at a general audiences and plants both feet in the kids' market. From here on out, these movies are kids' movies, through and through. Every Showa entry that follows centers its attention on child protagonists, and it's obvious that this decision was not made halfway. This is where Daiei commits fully to courting the younger audience. Whether or not that decision was the right one is subjective, but it's a line in the sand. Personally, I've never been all that enthusiastic about this pivot myself. I still think Gamera vs. Barugon struck the perfect balance. It treated its story with sincerity, gave weight to the conflicts, and had no interest in playing to the Saturday matinee crowd. It was mature without being dour, and I wish that more of the series had followed that path. But I've always believed in meeting a movie where it's at. It's the mindset that I have of critique the movie for what it is and not for what I wanted it to be. Looking at what Gamera vs. Viras is and not what I wanted it to be, it's a mediocre kids movie at best. That's why I'm not going to be spending this whole retrospective complaining that Gamera vs. Viras isn't Gamera vs. Barugon. It's a kids movie, and I'm going to judge it accordingly. I think the fairest way to approach this movie is through a compliment sandwich. I'll start with the things that it does right, move into what holds it back, and then finish on a positive note. Because while I don't think Viras is particularly a good movie, it's still a product of people trying to make something work with very little money. There's something worth salvaging here, even if the final result is not good. Let's start with what the film gets right. The Virian spaceship is genuinely stunning. It's the one part of the film that actually feels like someone was trying to create something memorable. It is surreal and offbeat in a way that nothing else in the movie even attempts. It reminds me of concept art from Jodorowsky's Dune, filled with bold shapes and strange textures that feel truly alien. The interiors are just as inspired. Everything is built with a clear sense of texture and composition. Even when the materials look really cheap, the layout and lighting make up for it tenfold. There's a deliberate use of color that's missing from most of the film, and the set designers clearly understood how to create visual rhythm, even when the budget just wasn't there. Viras is another highlight. His design is grotesque and specific. There's nothing generic about him. He could have easily just been a giant squid. But he has this like stiff, segmented movement that makes him feel like something pulled from a nightmare. The smaller Virians in their true form look great too, but you barely see them. The movie makes the baffling choice to hide them behind human disguises for nearly the entire film. That decision kneecaps the atmosphere. Instead of strange, squid-like invaders, we get a group of interchangeable men in jumpsuits droning through exposition. I understand it was a cost-saving measure, but it robs the film of its best assets. There's one moment that hints at what could have been, and that's the constant usage of the alien's eyes glowing yellow through the dark. It's very chilling. It's very understated. It works so well, and for a second, the Virians feel like they're actually threatening. But the film just doesn't build on it. It immediately shifts back to safe, unthreatening territory. Every time Gamera vs. Viras brushes up against something visually striking or tonally eerie, it retreats back. You can feel the potential, you can see it in the concept work, but the film is constantly undermining itself to cut costs or to avoid scaring the kiddies. That's what makes it so frustrating, because there is something great here. The people designing the creatures and the sets were doing real work. The rest of the film just doesn't rise to that level. Now let's talk about the bad. Gamera vs. Viras leans way too hard on stock footage. It's not even subtle about it. The Virians literally sit down and watch clips from the previous movies to learn about Gamera's history. That is the setup. They play entire scenes from earlier films, framed as exposition, and expect you to go along with it. It is lazy, plain, and simple. It doesn't feel like a nod or a recap. It's just filler for a movie that's already 72 minutes. It's barely a movie. I'm sure if you cut out all the stock footage, it's not even a full-length feature film. And I get it. I've gotten comments before where people say, well, stock footage back then wasn't too bad because, there wasn't really home media releases yet. And so people saw these movies in theaters and then didn't see them for a while. And so the stock footage was kind of new. But to me, I just think it's still lazy. It still shows how cheap the film is. It's a pain to sit through. It really is. And even in the theatrical cut, which does trim things down a lot, the reliance is just so obvious. Most of the movie, 95% of it, is watching these kids explore the alien ship, and it just causes the pacing to drag for a movie that is, again, 72 minutes long. You get sudden beats of action, and then you kind of wake up and go, oh my god, this is going to be great. And then you realize it's not new footage. It's Gamera destroying Tokyo in black and white. Yes, this movie is in color, and they just cut to black and white scenes and expect you to not care or notice. It completely breaks the flow of the movie. If they'd bothered to present it as a flashback or a stylized archive video feed in the Virian spaceship, it might have worked, but they don't. They just dump entire destruction scenes into the runtime to pad things out. It reeks of desperation. This series already feels like it's eating itself to stay afloat, and we're only 4 movies in. There are still 4 more entries left in the Showa era, and we know where this trend leads, with Gamera Super Monster being almost wall-to-wall stock footage, and you can trace the rot right back to this movie, Gamera vs. Viras. It unfortunately sets the precedent that recycling old material is an acceptable solution. On top of that, the child protagonists are just unbearable to watch. The movie hands them the spotlight and never takes it back. They talk constantly, and none of it matters. Their dialogue isn't charming or clever or even functional. It's noise. I don't mind child leads in kaiju films when they're used well. Godzilla's Revenge worked for what it was. Godzilla vs. Hedorah gave the kid a clear perspective in a world that's falling apart. But the kids in Gamera vs. Viras are just stuck on a loop. They wander the spaceship, repeat the same exposition, and drag the pacing down with them. This could have been a really fun and tense setup of kids are trapped on an alien spaceship. Like, you could do a Goonies type thing with it, and it would have a ton of potential. But nothing interesting ever happens. There's no mystery to solve. We know the aliens are bad guys. There's never any escalating danger. It's just two flat characters walking through hallways, narrating the obvious while the film kills time. There's never any urgency or momentum. It's just delay. And again, the pacing is a disaster. 72 minutes should fly by. Instead, it feels like a slog. I caught myself checking the runtime halfway through, hoping it was almost over. Every scene just blends together. Stock footage does break up the monotony, but even that gets old fast. You start hoping that something new will happen, only to get more aimless wandering. There is one moment in this movie that comes close to having emotional weight, and it's when the boys tell the military to destroy the spaceship, even if it means killing them in the process.
Sister, please tell this to the others. Blast the spaceship. Don't think about us.
It's unexpectedly dark for like no reason. It comes out of nowhere.
Go on. We want you to do it.
Jim! Oh, Jim! Oh, Jim!
Like the parents are there and they're crying and like everyone's like, oh my god.
Mama, Papa, please understand. All that matters is rescuing the Earth.
The military's gonna have to kill these kids. But then the movie backs out almost immediately and NATO calls and they're like, we're not fucking doing that shit. We're not gonna bomb kids.
We can't sacrifice the boys to them. We've been ordered to surrender.
From there, then, the movie slides right back into cartoon logic. The boys try to free Gamera from mind control. The aliens get louder, the ship gets brighter, and nothing surprises you. Nothing builds. The film just drifts towards the finish line, hoping you don't notice how little is actually happening. Getting back to what works now, we're gonna stop being toxic for a little bit. Gamera vs. Viras has some of the strongest underwater sequences in the entire Showa era. No question. These scenes look better than anything Toho ever pulled off underwater, including in films like Godzilla vs. the Sea Monster, which should have delivered in that area, but it just didn't. The movie had Godzilla fighting a giant lobster and still managed to make the ocean feel weightless and empty. Viras, on the other hand, actually uses the water. You can feel the drag, the force, and the impact of the movement. The miniature work also sells the scale really well. It's one of the few moments where the film feels tactile. The downside is that you have to wait for it. Gamera and Viras don't even trade blows until the final stretch of the movie. It takes way too long to get there, but once it hits, it delivers. The fight is absurd in all the right ways. There's a moment where Gamera is swimming full speed, ramming Viras across the ocean floor, and the theme music starts swelling, and then suddenly Viras gets stuck in the ground and Gamera launches himself over him like a skipping stone. That kind of timing works really well. It's so silly, and the energy is perfect. The whole final fight has the chaotic low-budget charm, and the puppetry and effects might be crude, but the filmmakers are leaning into it. They know what kind of movie this is. It also helps that, for once, Gamera finishes the job himself. For the past 2 movies now, Gamera has needed military intervention or a kid yelling distractions from the sideline in order to help him win the fight. Here, he is victorious on his own terms, and it's one of the few times in the movie where the stakes feel real and the payoff actually lands. Wrapping things up on a more positive note, because I hate being negative for a movie that had a budget this small and had almost nothing going for it, Gamera vs. Viras has real highlights. When the film works, it really works. But the lows are just so brutal. Long stretches of dead air, grating child performances, and shameless stock footage that just kills the pacing. It's not downright unwatchable, but it constantly gets in its own way. I never saw this one growing up, and if I had, maybe I could have had a soft spot for it. I can see a version of myself at age 7 thinking this was the coolest thing ever, but as a 22-year-old man sitting through it now, it's rough. The charm is buried under filler. You get glimpses of something fun, but you have to dig for them. Like, I love the scene of the kids in the submarine meeting Gamera underwater. It feels like something out of The Life Aquatic with Steve Zissou. It's great stuff. But watching this as an adult, it feels less like a movie and more like a product designed to hit a runtime to sell tickets to kids. There's still value in it, but you really have to want to find it. In 1969, Daiei was yet again facing serious financial trouble, but it still had one more Gamera film to deliver. Director Noriaki Yuasa and writer Nissan Takahashi returned, working with an even smaller budget and limited resources. To make the film stand out, they introduced Guiron, a space monster with a knife-like head inspired by ninja weapons. The original design was more abstract and difficult to execute, so the team simplified it into something more visually aggressive and easier to film. Despite the low budget, the production leaned on strong visual ideas that were very ambitious, like the alien world of Terra. Internationally, the film never received a theatrical release in the United States. Instead, it was dubbed and released straight to television under the title Attack of the Monsters, and later was featured on Mystery Science Theater 3000. The film's reception among fans and critics has always been a little mixed. While some saw it as a creative low point, others have admired its strange charm and bold monster design. In my opinion, it's very rough, but I still think it holds a very special place in the franchise's history and is one of the best, one of the worst, but without wasting any more time, let's get into it. This is Gamera vs. Guiron.
Let's go, Gamera!
Two boys, Akio and Tom, follow a mysterious spaceship and are transported to the alien planet of Terra. There they encounter two female aliens who plan to consume their brains. The planet is guarded by Guiron, a monster with a blade-shaped head who kills an attacking space Gyaos in a brutal fashion. Gamera arrives from Earth and battles Guiron in an effort to save the children. After a prolonged fight, Gamera defeats Guiron and helps the boys return home using the repaired spaceship. The film ends with the boys reunited with their families and Gamera flying off into the distance.
So long, Gamera! Thank you, Gamera! Goodbye, Gamera!
Gamera vs. Guiron feels like the crew just grabbed the script for Gamera vs. Viras, changed a few names, pointed at the page, and said, "That'll do." The setup is identical. Two boys get kidnapped by aliens with glowing yellow eyes. Most of the movie is them wandering around a spaceship while Gamera shows up now and then to fight a monster. I couldn't stand Gamera vs. Viras. It drags like crazy, it leans too heavily on stock footage to the point where half of the movie is just a clip show, and it barely holds itself together. But Gamera vs. Guiron as a movie isn't as miserable to get through. The stock footage isn't as bad this time around, and the monster fights actually feel like new material instead of recycled leftovers. The pacing is still very rough at points, but at least you don't spend the whole runtime waiting for something to happen. That's about as much praise as I can reasonably give it. Underneath all of that, it's still the same structure. You've got the same hollow kids sci-fi framework. The problem is that there's just long stretches of the film where the kids are just poking around the spaceship, watching Guiron fight Gamera, and rooting for their giant turtle protector. There's no tension or any story movement. You could cut entire sequences of the film out and the plot wouldn't change one bit. That's the movie in a nutshell. Just waiting around for Gamera to clock in and kick ass. What makes it frustrating is that you can tell there's a better version of this buried under all the fluff. If you cut down the wandering, let the monster fights play out without interruption, it could have been a solid movie. Instead, it's stuck halfway between being passable and being boring. Don't get me wrong, this is still a huge step up from Viras, but that's not really saying much. It's easier to sit through, sure, but it's not something you'll think about again once it's over. You watch it, you get a few good moments, and then it fades right out of your head. What actually pulls me back to Gamera vs. Guiron once in a while is the setting. Out of all the Showa Gamera films, this is the one that really leans into full-blown sci-fi. It throws Gamera into space and it keeps him there. Whole chunks of the movie take place on this alien planet, and that gives it a very different kind of energy compared to the usual city destruction stuff that we see in these movies all the time. It leans harder into that late 60s pulp sci-fi tone more than anything else in the series.
Greetings. We waited for you.
The Terrans themselves as alien villains are nothing to write home about. They have the same glowing yellow eyes as the Virians, the same role in the plot, and they exist to get the kids in trouble and give Gamera something to fight over. If you swap the names between movies, most people wouldn't even notice, but where the Terrans edge out the Virians for me is in the look and their motivations. Their planet, their costumes, the spaceship interior, it all hits that exact late 60s sci-fi vibe that feels cheap, but confident. It knows exactly what this is. Like, this isn't trying to be The Godfather Part 2. It knows that this is just another Gamera movie. You can tell they really didn't have much money to work with, but they used what they had in a way that leaves an impression. I also love the whole aliens that want to eat brains concept. It's definitely cheesy, but for a sci-fi kids adventure movie, it's great stuff on paper. But you never once buy into the idea that Akio and Tom are actually in danger. There's never any sense of urgency, and it just feels like you're always waiting around until the next monster scene. Which, let's talk about that, because it is the highlight of the entire movie. The monster action is the one thing in Gamera vs. Guiron that lands perfectly. No question. That is where the movie puts all of its effort. Gamera does his usual routine, showing up whenever the kids get in trouble, but even if the role feels a bit autopilot-esque, where it's like, we know exactly what we're doing here, we're just going to rinse and repeat the usual Gamera stuff, he still feels big and imposing on screen while coming off as a friendly protector of children, and honestly, that never changes, no matter how repetitive the formula gets. What really sticks with you, though, is Guiron. The design is so sharp and specific in a way that most kaiju from this era aren't. Once you see him, you remember him. Knife for a head, reptilian body, glowing eyes. It's weird, but it works. And what makes it click even more is how he moves in the fight scenes. There's this harsh, deliberate style to his attacks. Every movement is very heavy and dangerous. Again, this really doesn't feel like you're seeing a guy in a suit flail around. This is a monster with purpose behind what he's doing. His roar helps too. That deep, slow bellow almost feels like he's laughing while he fights. It adds to that off-kilter alien energy. Gamera is loud and straightforward, while Guiron sounds like he knows something that you don't. Guiron's fights are shot mostly in these static wide angles that let you really see the weight behind each swing. There's hardly any frantic cutting or shaky camera work that modern kaiju films like to fall back into. Instead, we get something simple and slow-paced. It works, and honestly, I wouldn't have it any other way. It also allows for you to have some really bizarre moments, like the iconic scene where Gamera is doing gymnastics. I love with Gamera films from this era how the camera just sits back and films everything as is. It adds to the scale, and it also kind of hides the poor set work that is involved, given that these films have such a small budget. Then there's the Space Gyaos fight. Now, Space Gyaos as a monster feels like a complete afterthought. It's just Gyaos. Again. Painted silver with zero new abilities or purpose. Same sound effects, same everything. It's padding in the most obvious way, but the fight scene is insanely brutal for something that's meant to be in a kid's movie. Gyaos gets sliced apart piece by piece. Head, wings, arms. Watching it, you can tell the whole point of that scene is to make it clear that Guiron is a genuine threat. Gyaos wrecked Gamera the last time they fought, with Gamera only narrowly beating Gyaos with the help of the JSDF. Meanwhile, Guiron absolutely slaughtered Gyaos instantly. By the time Gamera steps in, you already know what Guiron is capable of, and it makes the final fight carry a lot of tension in that regard. Obviously, they're not going to kill Gamera. Duh. But For all the film's problems, that sense of physicality in the monster scenes really gives it something to hold on to. It's the one part where the film truly feels alive. Gamera vs. Guiron, though, really doesn't have anything else going on beneath the surface. It's just monster fights and alien sets. No message, no bigger idea. It's shallow in a way that feels deliberate, like they didn't care about anything beyond hitting the usual beats. People always like to pull the "it's a movie for kids" card with these late Showa Gamera movies, but I don't think that cuts it. Being a kids movie isn't an excuse to make something this empty. There are plenty of films aimed at kids that still bother to introduce real stakes or some kind of theme or point. This doesn't. Beyond the scene at the end where one of the boys just starts rambling about like, oh, we should try and be all peaceful and, no violence, which it just comes out of nowhere. It's so weird.
We should work to make it better. We shouldn't long for other stars. Just try love instead. Stop wars and no more accidents. I guess that's all I can ask.
You're right.
The majority of the film is just them wandering around spaceships and the alien planet, getting from one fight to the next. It's the same as Viras. You watch Guiron slice up Gyaos, Gamera shows up to finish things, and then it's done. There's no build-up, nothing. Once those two moments hit, there's nothing left to really take from it. It's dumb fun, sure, but that's all it is. It doesn't leave you with anything of substance, making it the equivalent of kaiju fast food.
I love cheese. Da-da. Ah!
By 1970, Daiei was falling apart. Years of bad management had gutted the studio, and the Japanese film industry as a whole was shrinking thanks to television pulling audiences away from the theater. At that point, the Gamera series was pretty much the only thing keeping Daiei alive. Gamera vs. Jiger was the sixth entry, and the production ran into money problems almost immediately. Director Noriaki Yuasa even had to go directly to the studio president and beg for extra money just to build the miniature sets and effects that the movie needed. The big hook this time around was the 1970 World's Fair in Osaka. A lot of the film was shot at the actual expo grounds, which gave it a unique setting compared to the other Gamera movies, but filming there came with a catch. Expo officials didn't want to see their brand new buildings being trashed on screen, so Daiei agreed that Gamera and Jiger wouldn't destroy any of the expo structures. Screenwriter Nissan Takahashi even defended the decision, saying it would have been in bad taste to show Gamera wrecking the World's Fair. He worried that kids might start resenting Gamera as the monster that destroyed the expo. So, in a weird way, Gamera vs. Jiger is probably the only kaiju movie where the monsters had to follow a no-destruction rule in their contract. The movie hit theaters in 1970 as a double feature with the samurai adventure, The Invisible Swordsman. Hard numbers on its box office are tough to find, but by then the series was clearly losing steam, and Jiger didn't change that. It did fine with the kids, but wasn't nearly enough to pull Daiei out of its financial spiral. Outside of Japan, American International Television picked it up for US syndication under the title Gamera vs. Monster X. Decades later, it even got the Mystery Science Theater 3000 treatment in 2022. Like most of the late Showa Gamera films, it has the reputation of being a cheap kids movie that's entertaining in a goofy kind of way. But I found myself actually kind of loving this movie. It has some bizarre moments, it has some really good moments, and some really bad, so let's dive in. This is Gamera vs. Jiger. At Expo 1970 in Osaka, a mysterious statue called the Devil's Whistle is unearthed, unleashing the monster Jiger. Gamera tries to stop her, but is poisoned when Jiger implants an egg in his chest. As Gamera lies near death, children pilot a mini-submarine into his body, discover baby Jiger, and kill it using white noise. Revived with electricity, Gamera battles Jiger again at the World's Fair. She unleashes quills, heat rays, and her stinger, but Gamera adapts, smashes her tail, and finally kills her by impaling her with the Devil's Whistle before returning her body to Wester Island. As I mentioned at the start of this video, I loved Gamera vs. Jiger. Right off the bat, one of the strongest elements in Gamera vs. Jiger is how it uses the Expo grounds as its main setting. It gives the film a visual identity that actually stands out from the usual recycled cityscapes or the same cramped spaceship interiors that we're so used to at this point. The Expo adds color, scope, and energy to every frame. The architecture and displays showcase the optimism of the period, a forward-looking view of technology that grounds the monster mayhem in something tangible. What also works is how the Expo setting folds directly into the story itself. Gibo, the envoy from Wester Island, frantically warns the Expo organizers not to tamper with the Devil's Whistle, but his warnings fall on deaf ears. That moment of arrogance sets everything in motion. The theme of arrogance runs through the film in a way that feels sharper than anything in the last two entries. I would go as far as to say that the last two movies didn't even have a theme in mind. It was just mindless entertainment. For Gamera vs. Jiger, you can read this film as being a commentary on cultural blindness. Outsiders dismissing the knowledge of the people who actually live with these traditions. The Expo is supposed to be this celebration of the world and multiculturalism, but it's closer to something like Disney's Epcot or It's a Small World, where everything is just sunshine and rainbows, and it's a very surface-level understanding of these foreign cultures. The Wester Islanders know the Devil's Whistle isn't just some ancient artifact to be displayed like a prize, but the Expo officials wave it off in the name of progress. There's a subtle irony here, since the Expo itself is supposed to be a monument to human achievement, yet it's that same faith in advancement that blinds them to the dangers of their own ignorance. Compared to Gamera vs. Viras and Gamera vs. Guiron, this feels like a massive leap forward. Those films stranded their human characters in plots that revolved around kids exploring spaceships with no dramatic tension whatsoever. But here, there's real conflict driving the story, and it ties directly into the larger themes. It's not just monsters smashing things for 90 minutes and then that's the movie. Now, I know what you may be thinking. Aren't you a guy that talks about giant monster movies on the internet? Shouldn't you just care about the fight scenes and that's it? To that I say no. These are real movies, and as a fan of them, I want them to be taken seriously, so you have to critique them in good faith in order to do that. You can't just blindly love a movie because you like giant monsters. You have to be critical of things that you love because you want them to be better. If you dumb down kaiju movies into just giant monsters hitting each other, I don't really think you're a fan, and I don't really think that you want these movies to be taken seriously by the general public. So that's why for a movie as dumb as Gamera vs. Viras, I'm still critiquing it like a real movie, as some people in the comments were actually upset by me doing. So, in short, the reason I take these movies seriously is out of love for them, because they deserve to be taken seriously. Getting back to the movie itself, I find it really funny how the Expo ends up being treated like the crown jewel of civilization in the middle of a full-scale monster attack. Whole city blocks are leveled, thousands of people are probably dead, yet every character acts like the real tragedy would be if the Expo got even scratched. It plays almost like a running gag. You can buy it when the kids obsess over it because it fits their perspective, but the adults being just as dismissive of the widespread destruction feels really strange and off-putting. It's one of those moments where the priorities of the filmmakers are obvious, and while it makes sense for the target audience, it comes off as being oddly detached from the reality of the destruction that we're watching. It cracks me up how Gamera vs. Jiger once again pairs a Japanese kid with a white kid. This is the third film in a row that runs with this setup, and by this point it feels impossible to see it as anything but a studio mandate. You can practically picture the memo from the American backers saying, make sure there's at least one white kid for the US audiences to latch onto. The formula is just so obvious that it borders on parody. It's as if Daiei had a checklist and right under giant monster suit and miniature buildings, there was a line that read, insert token white kid. It's hilarious. To me, what makes it so funny is how transparent the whole thing is. The series bends over backwards to justify why this random foreign kid is just hanging around, and it never feels natural. You can almost sense the production trying to bridge markets in real time, but instead it ends up creating this weird cultural oddity that has aged in the most amusing way possible. The kids here actually do a decent job of not being obnoxious, aside from the constant shouting during the final fight with Jiger, where they treat Gamera like he needs a pair of backseat drivers during combat.
Gamera, don't give up! Keep going, Gamera, get it!
Come on, Gamera! Gamera!
Gamera, use your fire! That's good, Gamera!
Let's go!
Fight on! Careful, Gamera!
The needle!
Like, after a while, you're just like, shut the fuck up.
Gamera, put it in the air, up in the air!
Gamera!
Come on, you can do it! Get it up in the air!
Even with that, though, they feel like the most balanced child pairing that we've seen so far. I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that their involvement doesn't just amount to them wandering around aimlessly like in Viras or Guiron. They participate and take risks, and the danger they face feels real enough to create some actual tension. Comparisons to the last two films make this stand out even more. Viras and Guiron were so flat in how they handled the kids that this feels like a massive improvement by default. There's a baseline level of effort here that makes the human side of the story watchable. It's still a kid-centric storyline, but it functions, and in the world of Showa Gamera, that's almost a victory in and of itself. Jiger is a great monster. The design stands out, and the English dub giving her the title of a demon from hell adds a pulpy, almost mythic edge to the character. The first fight between Gamera and Jiger is a highlight, with a level of brutality that feels more intense than usual for the series. I like that she's able to actually sideline Gamera for such a long stretch, which opens the door for extended destruction sequences where Jiger has the stage all to herself. It gives her more presence and makes her feel dangerous in a way that some of the other villains never quite managed. There's also a body horror element in Gamera vs. Jiger that lands surprisingly well. Jiger infects Gamera and leaves him essentially impregnated, which is a shocking turn for a film aimed at kids. The whole sequence predates Alien by nearly a decade, and the parallels are hard to miss. The act is invasive, unsettling, and far more vicious than anything we've seen from Gamera's rogues gallery up until this point. Jiger being the first female kaiju in the franchise makes this angle even more striking from a thematic point of view. Her abilities revolve around reproduction, but the film twists that into something grotesque. Instead of nurturing or protective qualities, reproduction becomes a weapon, a way of corrupting the opponent from the inside. It turns Gamera's struggle into something more disturbing than just a simple defeat. His body is compromised, and the kids literally have to travel inside of him to fix the damage. That decision makes Jiger stand out in a very meaningful way because she embodies themes of invasion and corruption, but with a biological edge that feel unique to the series. The infection plotline just adds so much to the movie, and it makes her threat feel inescapable. Out of all the villains in this era, she feels like the most dangerous because you know that she could very easily knock Gamera out and then multiply herself via forced impregnation. It's wicked stuff for a kid's movie. The sequence where the kids shrink down in a submarine and explore inside Gamera is fantastic. It has the same surreal educational sci-fi vibe as something like Disney's Body Wars. That's the second time I referenced Disney here, and I don't know why. This movie just kind of has a Disney World vibe to it. The discovery of the baby Jiger living inside Gamera adds a lot of tension, and watching the boys have to deal with it is one of the movie's best scenes. It honestly kind of feels like something out of the Goonies when they're exploring around the inside of Gamera and then suddenly they see this monster and it becomes like a 1950s sci-fi romp. It's great stuff. Though the most shocking moment, at least for me, was Jiger's death scene, which goes way harder than you would expect. Gamera impales her with a fucking statue through the skull, like a vampire being staked. It's violent, sudden, and grotesque, and the film actually pauses to let that sink in. There's a beat of silence where everyone just stares in complete and total disbelief, and it sells the brutality of that final blow. Like, oh shit, Gamera just did that. However, throughout this movie, the pacing can definitely feel uneven, with most of the big monster action being stacked towards the beginning and the end, and normally I'd knock a Gamera film for following that structure, but it works here because of how the downtime is used. Gamera being incapacitated still matters because the kids are literally inside him. Pause, that sounds really bad. They're in his body with a You get it, you're watching the video. What I'm getting at is the movie keeps him present and in focus when there's not fights happening. In a strange way, this might be the Gamera movie where he gets the most focus because everything revolves around him, or at least his body, his condition, and his eventual recovery. This is the most alive that Gamera has felt since maybe Gamera vs. Gyaos or Gamera vs. Barugon. Alright, look, I'll be completely transparent here. I went into this dragging my feet. I kept putting this retrospective off because I remember the later Gamera Showa films being a blur of cheap sets and half-baked kids' plots. I was convinced this would be another slog, but sitting down with it again completely flipped that expectation. Gamera vs. Jiger turned out to be a diamond in the rough, a movie that remembers these stories can still have drama, spectacle, and actual themes without drowning in childish nonsense. This entry fixes nearly every problem that dragged down the last two. The visuals have ambition, the characters have personality, and the story doesn't feel disposable. By the end, I realized I wasn't just relieved it wasn't bad, I was actively enjoying myself. Out of the Showa era so far, this might be the one that impressed me the most, and I could see myself revisiting it long after this retrospective series is over. By 1970, Daiei Studios was falling apart. I know I've said that multiple times throughout this retrospective series, but it's actually for real, like they are falling apart. Despite the inevitable bankruptcy ahead of them, though, they still pushed ahead with another Gamera movie. Director Noriaki Yuasa had the idea for a new Gamera movie where he would fight a shark after hearing about a shark attack off Japan's coast. Screenwriter Nissan Takahashi came back to write the script and leaned into the growing concern over pollution. Zigra's backstory tied directly into that theme. His planet had been ruined by toxic oceans, so now he comes to Earth looking for a new home. It lined up perfectly with the environmental mood in Japan at the time. Toho was already making Godzilla vs. Hedorah with the same kind of message, and Daiei even scheduled Gamera vs. Zigra to come out just a week before. The problem was, Daiei didn't have the money to back it up. The studio had been mismanaged for years, and by 1971, it was collapsing. Zigra's budget was cut down to about 35 million yen, which sounds like a lot, but that's actually 235,000 US dollars. This was one of the lowest in the entire series. Filming for certain scenes were delayed, rewritten, or just canceled outright. Yuasa originally planned several elaborate underwater battles, but he had to scrap them. Meanwhile, Daiei was literally laying off hundreds of employees. They were selling off their assets and even firing Yuasa from his staff position. He only stayed on as a freelancer just to see that the movie was finished. Like, think about that for a second. He's literally working his ass off for the love of the game to get this movie done. Regardless of the quality, you gotta respect that. Through thick and thin, Noriaki Yuasa has just been the MVP of all the Gamera movies. He had to deal with so much crap from Daiei, all the awful financial decisions that they made. He's still stuck with them, he's still stuck with the character. I mean, he directed every single movie in the Showa era. Like, it's nuts how much dedication and loyalty that man had to the character of Gamera. A lot of people like to talk about Ishiro Honda or even Jun Fukuda. You know, they were behind a lot of the Godzilla Showa era movies, even Yoshimitsu Banno. But not enough people praise or even talk about Noriaki Yuasa. Like, seriously, this dude is a production beast. I don't know, I just want to take some time here to just praise that man for the hard work, knowing the shit he had to go through for well over a decade. Getting back to Gamera vs. Zigra specifically, the casting was really strange. Kids were still the center of the story, and this one followed a Japanese boy named Kenichi and an American girl named Helen. They did this to keep that international angle alive, but the villain is really where things get weird. She was played by Eiko Yanami. She was an actress who was known for starring in very sexually explicit and erotic thrillers, who spends most of this movie, a kid's movie, running around SeaWorld in a bikini. It's a pretty blatant attempt to lure in dads who had to take their kids to the theater, but it's just so bizarre. Like, I don't know, man, it'd be like if some random OnlyFans girl was all of a sudden in, like, Incredibles 3. It's like, what are we doing? Speaking of SeaWorld, it actually became the backbone of the entire movie, and it's pretty interesting how that happened. The aquarium had just opened in 1970, and Daiei, of course, being the cheapskates that they are, leaned on it as a cost-saving measure. Instead of building new sets, they shot on location, showing off dolphin shows and exhibit halls. The deal came with one catch. The park couldn't be destroyed, much like how the expo in Gamera vs. Jiger also couldn't be destroyed, so that meant no city smashing and no major landmarks going down. Tonally, the movie leans all the way into childlike silliness. Gamera rescues kids, lectures humanity about pollution, and humiliates Zigra by playing the Gamera March on his back like a xylophone. Zigra is one of the weirder villains, and we'll get more into him, but he actually talks. It's through the means of telepathy, but it's one of the few kaiju that actually speaks, I guess you could say Japanese, but it would be English in the dub, whichever you pick. When the movie came out in July 1971, it barely made a dent. Critics dismissed it, box office was weak, and American distributors didn't even bother picking it up. Within weeks, Daiei officially declared bankruptcy.
I declare bankruptcy!
They had already started planning the next Gamera movie. It was supposed to feature a two-headed monster. Ironic because, Ghidorah is a three-headed monster, and Gamera has always kind of played second fiddle to Godzilla. However, that movie was scrapped. The studio's collapse killed it before it even reached the script stage. So, Gamera vs. Zigra ended up being the last gasp of the original Daiei era. It's a strange mix of environmental allegory, children's adventure, and studio desperation, wrapped up in the same financial crisis that finally shut the lights off for good. An alien spaceship devastates a Japanese moon base before descending into Earth's oceans. Inside, the invaders, Zigrans, reveal their plan to conquer humanity and use Earth's oceans as their own. Their ship soon transforms into Zigra, a massive swordfish-like monster with laser beams, hypnosis, and a freezing ray that nearly kills Gamera. Immobilized, the giant turtle sinks until lightning revives him. Gamera battles Zigra across land and sea, suffering deep wounds from Zigra's blade-like fins. In the final showdown, Gamera hoists Zigra up into the air and slams him onto the shore, and humiliates him before burning him to ash with his flame breath. Gamera vs. Zigra is a really weird movie. It tries to hang everything on this environmental message, which makes sense given the early 1970s in Japan, and on paper it mirrors Godzilla vs. Hedorah, which came out that same year, but even mentioning Zigra in the same sentence as Hedorah feels wrong. In case you don't know, Godzilla vs. Hedorah is one of my all-time favorite movies ever. In that movie, Hedorah actually represents pollution in a way that's grotesque and meaningful, just like how Godzilla in 1954 embodied nuclear devastation. Zigra, on the other hand, is an alien shark who complains about pollution while trying to conquer Earth. Instead of actually showing us anything powerful or creative, the film has Woman X spouting lines about how pollution is bad. It really doesn't work. Having a character just say the theme out loud is lazy and dull. It borders on being like a after-school special. And it gets worse because she's the villain. That undercuts the entire story because the antagonist should challenge the lesson, not preach it. When the villain and the film are on the same side, you don't really get any conflict. There's no tension and no point to actually telling the story. Instead of showing us why pollution is destructive through story or imagery, Zigra just has its villain stand on a soapbox and explain it to the audience. The setting makes things even stranger. Like Destroy All Monsters, this film places itself in the future, complete with a moon base. And like that movie, it does absolutely nothing with the idea. The future setting barely exists outside of a destroyed base and a few space shots. That's it. So, I have to ask, why even bother? Daiei was in deep financial trouble, so spending money on sets like that without really utilizing them in a necessary way feels so bizarre. The concept could have added some texture to the story, and maybe we can go on a retro-futuristic kind of angle, but it's just there. It's very empty and unfinished. At one point in the movie, I almost had a heart attack, not because I'm fat, but because Woman X declares, "Creatures of the Earth, rise!" And I was fully expecting the movie to dive into a stock footage montage where we just see Gamera fight every other monster from every other prior movie. Thankfully, that didn't happen, but that had been Daiei's kind of go-to survival tactic for, padding the runtime. So it didn't happen. Thank God. And this movie is actually mostly free of stock footage. I don't think that should count as an achievement, but at this point in the series, I will take what I can get. Now, speaking of criticisms for this movie, there is one I do want to talk about. It's not one that I actually have, but one that I've heard a lot of people rip on this movie for, and I'm actually going to defend it here. It doesn't deserve it. That would be the inclusion of SeaWorld. It is one of the most criticized parts of the movie, with letterboxd reviews mocking how an environmentalist story spends so much time glorifying an amusement park that's built on animal cruelty and captivity. You will see that take a lot. Way more than you probably should. And I kind of get it at first, I'm not a SeaWorld fan by any means. But the SeaWorld in this film and in real life has nothing to do with the American company that's notorious for abuse and controversy. This is a totally separate and independent Japanese facility that has earned awards for its conservation work and marine biology education. It unfortunately shares the name, but it should not carry the baggage of the United States parks. So, in my opinion, dragging the movie for including SeaWorld is downright misinformed.
You're not just wrong, you're stupid.
Jiger himself has a really strong design. The fact that his spaceship mirrors his actual appearance is a really fun detail, as if he demanded a warship being modeled after his own body. He's also one of the rare kaiju with a human voice, which gives his scenes a very strange feel. The problem is that none of this goes anywhere. Jiger never lives up to his potential. Instead of being a terrifying alien shark, he spends the film getting humiliated. Gamera drags him around, slices him up, and even plays his back like a xylophone. He doesn't connect to the environmental theme beyond exposition dumps, and he doesn't pose a real threat. What could have been one of the more memorable villains ends up being nothing more than wasted potential. And for a kids' movie, Gamera vs. Jiger is weirdly horny. Like I mentioned at the start of this, Woman X is in a bikini through most of the movie, and the male characters just stare at her like they're Beavis and Butthead. It plays like pulpy sci-fi schlock, like something you'd see in a Grindhouse movie, but this isn't Grindhouse, this is a kid's movie. It feels tonally off. That being said though, she is still a great villain. I've always liked when these movies throw in a strong female antagonist, like Namikawa in Invasion of Astro Monster. Woman X isn't written well by any means, but she's still fun to watch. Her power of knocking people out with an intense stare is straight out of Ultraman with my goat, my favorite kaiju ever, Baltan. The human story here is fine. It's not memorable, but it isn't painful either. The best parts are when Woman X is stalking the kids like she's the Terminator, but she actually can't finish the job. She paralyzes adults with ease, yet when it comes to two small little kids, she ends up fumbling around and knocking over furniture while they escape in slapstick chase scenes. These scenes are cute and endearing, but being a 22-year-old man watching this after a long day of working my day job just makes me wonder where I went wrong in my life. By the end, it's clear the movie is running on fumes. The formula is worn out, the Gamera suit looks pretty rough, the story is predictable, and you can see the ending coming from the start. That's the problem with late-period Gamera. Godzilla movies of the same era kept experimenting with tone, swinging from psychedelic horror to slapstick comedy to bleak social commentary. Each entry stood apart. Gamera just recycled the same outline over and over again. Two kids are in danger, Gamera saves them, monster fight, credits. Gamera vs. Jiger just doesn't feel distinct from Gamera vs. Viras or Gamera vs. Guiron beyond setting. They blur together into the same movie replayed 3 times. I honestly think that repetition is the biggest reason why Gamera vs. Zigra and the Gamera franchise as a whole flopped. It wasn't bold or fresh, and audiences could really feel it.
10 years later.
By 1980, Daiei Film was barely alive. They were once a powerhouse with classics like Rashomon and the Gamera series, but the studio had collapsed in 1971 from reckless spending. Tokuma Shoten revived it, but the new Daiei was a shadow of its old self. Broke again by the end of the decade, management turned back to Gamera as a last-ditch money grab, and Gamera Super Monster was the result. Director Noriaki Uwasa, the GOAT, and writer Nissan Takahashi returned, but they weren't really making a new kaiju epic. They were ordered to build a story out of recycled monster fights from the 1960s. Daiei couldn't afford new suits or effects, so nearly all of Gamera's screen time is stock footage. A thin plot about an alien invader and 3 superhero space women exist only to string together the clips. Yuasa found the entire experience to be super disheartening. Known for elaborate effects, he was reduced to directing a clip show. He and Takahashi decided to end it with Gamera sacrificing himself to destroy Zen and Ship, sensing that this would be the character's last outing. The upbeat finale doesn't match the tragedy of the moment, but it gave the turtle a final bow. Released in March of 1980, Super Monster flopped. The recycled footage fooled no one, and Daiei filed for bankruptcy again within months. Gamera vanished for 15 years, with this movie serving as a farewell stitched together from old memories, marking the end of Gamera's first life on screen. This is Gamera Super Monster. As the alien warship Xanon sets its sights on Earth with plans for annihilation, humanity faces certain doom. The planet's superhero protectors, known as the Space Women, find themselves powerless against the vessel, its ruthless commander, and the monsters it commands. Their only chance lies with a young boy who shares a mysterious bond with Gamera. Summoned into battle once more, the giant turtle takes on familiar foes: Gyaos, Zigra, Viras, Jiger, Guiron, and Barugon, defeating them one by one through the use of relentless stock footage from prior films, thus saving the world one last time. I am genuinely conflicted about Gamera Super Monster. On the surface, it solves every problem that I had with movies like Gamera vs. Viras and Guiron. Those films dragged because the human drama was so dull and lifeless. Super Monster removes all of that and leaves a string of monster fights. In theory, that sounds ideal for the series. Like this could be Godzilla Final Wars, but for Gamera. But the issue is that it achieves this by recycling stock footage from every prior entry. Instead of new battles, the movie plays like a stitched-together highlight reel. During a franchise marathon like what I'm doing, that approach quickly becomes exhausting. The fights carry no weight because I've seen them already. The film often gets compared to Godzilla's Revenge, which I've defended before. That movie works because it uses stock footage in a very creative way. It frames the old battles as dreams of a lonely kid who imagines himself on Monster Island, so the recycled clips actually have purpose. The movies in the world of Godzilla's Revenge are just movies, so it would make sense that he would dream about him being in them. It's cool, I dig it. But Gamera Super Monster doesn't bother with a framework. It feels like Daiei decided to gather old fight scenes and then assemble them into a feature in hopes that the audience wouldn't care and they could make just a little bit of money. It becomes a SparkNotes version of the Showa era. Anyone new to the franchise gets a quick tour of the monsters without sitting through every film. I do think that has some appeal. Like, if you're a longtime fan, maybe skip. I mean, you've probably already seen it if you're a fan. But if you are a new fan, this might be the one to watch if you want to skip through all the Showa movies. Something I just love about this movie, though, is the fact that you can actually watch it and... You good? Something I do love about this movie is how you can watch it and just notice the seams and all the edits. Like, oh yeah, that's a new scene. That's an original scene. This is literally an extended bit from this movie where they just play it outright. It's really fun if you're a dork like me. I don't know, I just find enjoyment in pointing out which movie each scene came from. Something else that's really hard to ignore is how openly Gamera Super Monster borrows from the popularity of Star Wars and Superman. The influence is pretty blatant, and it makes the whole thing feel like a trend-chasing project. It plays out like a hollow imitation of those movies, and while you sit through it, the thought creeps in that watching the movies that it's copying would be a better experience and a better use of your time. What I expect from Gamera is not a space opera, especially a knockoff of one. One sequence almost duplicates the opening shot of A New Hope beat for beat. Seeing a warship glide overhead, framed in nearly the exact same angle, leaves no doubt about what they were trying to pull off. The strangest part is how dated this whole movie feels. The budget was clearly limited, and the crew seemed so intent on making the new footage blend with stock clips going back almost 2 decades. That attempt at consistency leaves the movie feel like it was frozen in time. Like, just think about this for a second. The Return of Godzilla came out only 4 years later. The gap in quality is just absurd when you look at it through that lens. Beyond that, though, there isn't much else to unpack. Most of this film is footage that I've already covered in earlier entries, which makes revisiting it feel redundant. About 90% of this comes from older Gamera movies, so what is there to talk about? On one hand, you could argue it's misunderstood. I mean, the structure totally resembles like a prototype for Final Wars, made in the 1980s, or even a bargain bin Destroy All Monsters, but it never earns that comparison because it has none of the charm that would make it work. The movie radiates cynicism. It exists to squeeze the last bit of money from the Gamera name before Daiei Studios goes completely bankrupt. It's a rough way to close the Showa era out. Instead of ending on something bold, it limps across the finish line with a patchwork of reused footage and little else. The effect is damaging. I really do think it drags down the reputation of the entire era, which was already shaky, but there are some wonderful bright spots like Gamera vs. Barugon, Gamera vs. Jiger, and Gamera vs. Gyaos. Without Shusuke Kaneko's acclaimed trilogy in the 90s, Gamera might have stayed cemented as nothing more than a joke character. I doubt he would be as taken seriously as he is. Kind of. I mean, he's still kind of a joke, but thankfully, Super Monster wasn't the end. The series would eventually rise again, and its best days were still ahead of it. And that is the Showa era of Gamera all wrapped up. This was such a fun video to make. It was very long in the making. This is multiple months worth of videos compiled into one big supercut, in case that wasn't obvious, given the change in appearance of me having a beard, me not having a beard, my hair growing as it kind of goes along. But if you made it this far in the video, thank you so much. I really wanted to shout out our channel members. Their names are going to be right here up on screen. Without them, I could not make the videos that I make for the channel. If you happen to be new to the channel, hi, welcome. I assume you like giant monsters. If so, I already talked about Godzilla, specifically the Showa era movies. So if you're curious about what I have to say with those movies, there's a 5-hour supercut of me talking about all that. So go and check that out after this. If you're curious to know kind of what's going on with the channel and what's going to happen next now that this phase of the channel is sort of over, I fully intend on talking about the Heisei trilogy from Shusuke Kaneko, as well as Gamera the Brave and Gamera Rebirth. That is 100% going to happen. I just need more time to work on that. Some of these entries for the Showa era are like 14 minutes long, because I didn't really have much to say about like Gamera versus Viras beyond it wasn't my thing. But with the trilogy, I adore those movies with every fiber of my being, so I have so much I want to say about them. So it's going to take a bit, and that's going to be just one big video as opposed to individual little videos about each entry in the trilogy. So stay tuned for that. I'd like to have that out by November. I'm also working on getting the Godzilla Heisei movies covered in their own retrospectives. Return of Godzilla is out right now. I'm writing and recording Godzilla vs. Biollante. So stay tuned for that. Thank you so much, by the way, for your time and for supporting the channel. We're almost at 50,000 subscribers, which is just insane to me. We hit 45,000 like a day ago, and that blew me away. So sincerely, from the bottom of my heart, thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. It means the most. So with that out of the way, I'm Cole McCormick. You're watching Firewood Media. I will see you in the next one. Peace out.